Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining me this morning to talk a little bit about the upside of stress. For those of you who have had the opportunity to join us over the course of the current parent lecture series that we've presented, you'll remember that the whole year has been spent talking about some of the different facets of stress, looking at all the different ways that stress can impact learning and all the different ways that it can sometimes hide behind other disorders. And most of the presentations have certainly had discussions of all the different helpful ways that you can deal with stress. But one of the pieces that we felt was important to wrap up our parent lecture series on this year was to really look at some of the positive ways that stress actually plays into our life. And anybody who would like to take a peek at any of the prior presentations, feel free to go on to Sasco River's YouTube channel. Everything is recorded there. You can take a peek at any of the ones from the current year or prior years, as well as a couple of other presentations we did during the pandemic. But you'll notice the theme going through this year of all the different ways that stress creeps into our life. From my perspective, one of the challenges with where we currently are in looking at the impact of stress is that we live in a culture where the dominant cultural view is that stress is bad for us, that stress is, if you just do a little Google search on various different headlines in the news, you'll come up with things like, stress, the silent killer, or stress at work will make you sick, and all of these other different headlines that basically create this drumbeat of all of the different ways that stress can negatively impact all the different functions within your body. And there certainly is a lot of research to say that that's absolutely the correct thing. But I think we're asking, or we're talking about the wrong focus, in my own opinion. I think that the reality that anyone on this call would probably acknowledge is the reality that stress is part of day-to-day existence. There's no possible way that you can exist in the world and function in the world without stress. In my opinion, stress, saying stress is bad is like saying, water is bad. Water it's something that is a part of our day-to-day life. It comes from the sky when it rains. We go swimming in it. We need it to feed our bodies. We drink it on a day-to-day basis. Too much water can be bad. Too little water can be bad, but the reality is water is something that is part of our day-to-day existence and needs to be part of our day-to-day existence. And I would put stress in that same category, that stress is part of our day-to-day existence. And if you exist in a mindset that goes down the path of, I have to eliminate stress from my life, you're going to be spending a lot of energy getting yourself into a place that is truly not attainable. And so that's what we're going to focus on today. And I thought that we would start with a couple of different sayings or things that I have come across in some of my research. This first one I love because it was posted by a 15-year-old on Instagram, and I think it captures what a lot of us run around the world feeling on a day-to-day basis. My stress stresses me out to the point where I'm too stressed to deal with stress. And I think that does capture a lot of the way that we very often live our lives. But then there's a couple of other ways that I think that are important to look at stress and anxiety. The greatest weapon against stress is our ability to choose one thought over another, which was stated by William James. For those of you who don't know who William James was, he's considered one of the founders of American psychology. And what he zeroed in on is the reality that what happens in stress is all to do with your mindset. It's all to do with how you think of stress, and the ability to cope effectively with stress is the ability to choose one way of thinking over another way of thinking. And then T.S. Eliot, the author T.S. Eliot, quoted, "Anxiety is the handmaiden of creativity." And that, I think, is one of the pieces I hope everybody spends a little bit of time internalizing, the idea that when you actually embrace the concept of stress and anxiety and look at its positive ways of contributing to your life, you can see how it creates so many positive outcomes, such as creativity, such as resilience. And why we're talking about this today is the reality that stress and anxiety is pervasive. It's, if you just do a quick look through the literature, about 30% of teenagers are meeting criteria for an anxiety disorder. Excessive stress leads to negative outcomes, including cancer and heart disease. Chronic stress can harm memory. Direct link found between chronic stress and risk for adult depression. So there is all these reality data points that we do need to consider. But to really complete the discussion, we're also going to be talking about finding that sweet spot. So we'll start with some definitions and terms. We'll talk about the science behind stress, the research that is currently coming out about the upsides of stress, and how it all depends upon your mindset and what the researchers term completing the stress response cycle. We'll talk about tips for strengthening your kids and your own response to stress. Wrap up with some resources and conclusions. At any point, if you've got questions, I will try to take a peek in the chat box. And I think I'm seeing a little bit there. Okay. Yeah, so someone is sending me, or actually my administrator is sending me, just to let people know that we are being recorded, and for everybody just to turn off your sound so that there's not a lot of back noise. But if folks do have questions, just post them in the chat. If you do want to pop in verbally because I'm not noticing the chat, feel free to jump right in. So hopefully this agenda captures why you signed on this morning. Let's start with a little bit around some of the definitions relating to stress. So just the basic definition of stress is that it's a natural human response that prompts us to address challenges or threats in our lives. And you'll see by that definition that there isn't really a value judgment to it. It's not that it's a good feeling or a bad feeling. It's a natural human response. It's something that we need to be able to exist in the world. It is something that has allowed humans to thrive through several centuries, several millennia, because it is something that prompts your nervous system to be able to respond appropriately. And some of the terms that you may or may not be familiar with is the term eustress. So if you look at this curve here, this is what's called the Yerkes-Dodson law. And the Yerkes-Dodson law simply, in a nutshell, says that stress exists on a continuum for all human beings, where what we are aiming for is to kind of find yourself in this little sweet spot, what is termed optimum stress. And that's basically what eustress is. Eustress simply refers to the positive challenges that we come upon in our life that create a cycle in our body that releases stress hormones so that we're able to properly address some of those challenges. Too little stress, if you're over here in this far left end of the curve, you basically are not responding to any of the day-to-day expectations very effectively. You may certainly be able to exist in your life in a relatively calm way, but you're probably not making a great deal of progress in your life. What research shows is necessary and optimal is to try to find yourself in this place within the stress continuum where your body is reacting with the release of the stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, that allow you to be able to be primed to be able to handle different situations effectively. But that you go through the cycle of stress and have a period of time where you're able to de-stress and allow the stress hormones to work their way through your body. Because if you go from one stress cycle to the next stress cycle to the next stress cycle, you move into what is termed distress, which is where the stress hormones never truly have the ability to work their way through, be broken down, so that your body returns to a level of stability or stasis. So that's where you start moving into this exhaustion end of the curve. If you find yourself constantly fatigued, you find yourself constantly reacting too quickly to situations and reacting with strong emotions that are really out of proportion to the situation, you're probably finding yourself in a little bit more of an exhausted state where it's causing a little bit too much stress in your life, and you're not allowing yourself to go through the complete cycle so that your body is burning off the stress hormones. And then if that exists over too long of a period of time, you move into what's called chronic stress. And that moves into what's called the anxiety, the panic area, the breakdown of your system. And that leads to the potential for burnout. That leads to the potential for chronic levels of stress that can turn into an anxiety response. Okay, so the Yerkes-Dodson law basically says we all exist on a continuum of stress. You're constantly wanting to try to find that sweet spot, what is called eustress. And so the science of stress is this stress response cycle where external events and sometimes internal events cause your brain to sense that there is a challenge in front of you. And that causes you to release the stress hormones. There are two different parts of the stress cycle. One is a very rapid release of adrenaline into your system that allows you to up your game. It allows your brain to actually think more quickly. It increases your heartbeat. It causes your muscles to go into a place where they're going to be able to react quickly if you need to escape a situation, or you need to perform effectively in an athletic endeavor, or you need to be able to access all the memorized lines when you're up on stage performing in front of people. That is that optimal level of stress where the adrenaline going into your system is actually priming your brain to perform at a higher level than you would typically respond at just going through your day-to-day life. And then your body begins to shift into a little bit of a longer response cycle, a different part of the nervous system that's releasing cortisol that just allows you to continue to function, allows you to be able to process what's going on, come up with a response to the situation, hopefully a helpful response to the struggle. But what happens for many of us is if you get into this loop of internal stress, turning you into the alarm stage, moving towards the exhaustion stage, and not recognizing what you need to do to process your way through the stressful situation, you move into chronic stress. And that's where there is just too much of a buildup of the stress hormones in your system. And one cycle leads into the next cycle and puts you into this place where your body begins to experience breakdown and experience fatigue and experience the inability to think clearly. You start going into more of a frozen emotional state or a chronic avoidance state of wanting to constantly try to get away from the stressful circumstance. So what the research currently is demonstrating is that the response to stress needs to move in a direction of needing to complete the stress response cycle. And what the researchers have tied this into is the discovery that this is true for every single emotion in our lives. If you're experiencing sadness and all you try to do is avoid what is making you feel sad, and you keep trying to avoid it, keep trying to deny that it's there in your life, keep trying to pretend that whatever it is that's causing the sadness is actually not there, or you go in the opposite direction if you dive into the deep end and you become married to your sadness and just wallow in your sadness. If you just get stuck in that cycle, that is what leads to depression. But if you allow the sadness to be there, to exist in this place of, yes, it's causing me discomfort, it's causing me this feeling of I don't like this feeling. But if you allow it to exist within your presence and kind of move your way through it and allow it to run its complete cycle, sadness just becomes a natural emotion that primes you to be able to come up with solutions and ways of being able to handle whatever triggers that might be leading you into that place. The same thing is true with the stress response cycle. If you allow for the reality and the absolute acceptance that stress will exist in your life, you allow it to cause you to move into that heightened response state. You allow yourself to sit into that discomfort and actually use the stress to be able to propel you in a more productive way. And you allow the cycle to go through its entire set of different steps by being able to then have calming strategies, have moments in life that break from the stress, allow it to work its way through, and you complete the stress response cycle. Stress is no longer a damaging force within your life. The same thing happens with our kids. And so just tying this into what you might see as a parent on a day-to-day basis, what we notice as adults in terms of our stress response cycle is the exact same thing that's happening in kids. And so if your kid got up this morning and is yelling and screaming and all upset about something, or can't even identify what they're upset about, they're in a moment where their stress cycle is causing them into a hyper alert mode. It's causing them to feel like they've got to fight. They've got to fly from the situation by either trying to escape or trying to avoid what they need to get done. Or they move into this freeze mode where they just kind of shut down. They pull the covers over their head. They don't prepare for the tests that they need to take. They just say, I don't know. They can't actually participate as meaningfully. So a lot of the ways that we very often look at behaviors in kids that we term as problematic behaviors, if you take a step back and look at what they might be communicating to us, you can start to see how it's their way of communicating where they are at in their own stress response cycle. And so sometimes if we as the adults in their life can communicate to them that we understand that they're under stress, we understand that this is really uncomfortable, we understand that it feels like this stress is never going to go away, but sit with the discomfort and recognize it's going to work its way through. And if you can start to educate your kids on this stress response cycle, they may find themselves not as overly responsive to it, and then leading into this place that's making your own life more miserable as well because they're so out of control. I'm going to take a quick 10-second pause and just ask, does anybody have any questions so far? See some thumbs up. So let's move into some of the research on the upside of stress. So I'm going to put on your radar this book by Kelly McGonigal that came out a few years ago that began this discussion of let's acknowledge that stress just is. It exists in our life. It's inevitable. And rather than looking at how can we avoid stress or try to eliminate it, how can we begin to embrace it more effectively? And how can we recognize the positive effects of stress so that we actually court stress to some degree so that it starts building more strength, more resilience, more ability to face the challenges in our life. And what McGonigal talked about, and several researchers since then have now turned into quantifiable data, is this last piece of it's your mindset that matters most when you're looking at stress. It's not the idea that stress is existing. It truly is what mindset you decide on and that you really put into place on a day-to-day basis, and recognizing that a stressful life actually can lead to a great deal of meaning. And so all the research that's come out over the last 10 years on this stress mindset has shown some really pretty incredible details that when we're looking at the ways that stress causes us to get sick and stress causes us to shut down and stuff like that, is missing a huge piece of the puzzle. And so a few years ago, a group of researchers led by Dr. Liu found that medical students who experienced moderate levels of stress had much better academic performance than those who experienced lower high levels of stress. So they did measures of stress that the person was able to identify, the different stressors they were able to point to in their life, and were able to kind of code them on the continuum between low stress, moderate stress, and high stress. And what they found is that the students that fit into that moderate level of stress actually had much greater performance on a variety of different academic measures, memory measures, and performance measures. A few years before that, a group of researchers found that stress was positively associated with work motivation among a group of employees in a large company. So what they did is they studied employees, and they actually found that the employees who actually looked at some of the different projects that existed and embraced those projects and saw them as challenges, but actually really saw them as challenges that they were interested in, actually had much greater overall levels of performance, as well as overall levels of reported satisfaction in their life and decreased levels of mental illness, mental stress. A group of medical researchers found something that really goes against a lot of the common wisdom relating to stress. A lot of the common wisdom and what you'll read in the New York Times and whatever your periodical of choice is that stress breaks down your immune system and causes you to have much greater possibility of illnesses and a variety of different things. And whereas that is true when it relates to chronic stress, what these researchers found is that brief acute stress, where you allow stress to run through the complete cycle of stress, actually boosts your immune system and allows you to fight off common infections much more effectively. Going back about 20 years was a really cool study done by Tedeschi and Calhoun that showed that people who went through a very traumatic, stressful period, and rather than looking at it as the thing that was going to totally throw their life off, but actually approached the traumatic event as an opportunity for making change in their life or an opportunity to learn from it, reported a great deal of life satisfaction and a feeling retrospectively that the trauma and the stress actually caused them to enter into a huge growth period in their life. And so what they found is that people who, rather than approaching stress from the mindset of it being something that was kind of an awful external event that was thrust upon them, and how could this have happened to them, that actually approached it from the idea of, this is what happens in life. And it wasn't directed at me. It was something that happened. It was awful. It was incredibly uncomfortable. It really did throw me off my track for a period of time, but used it in a way to really learn from it and to develop different skill sets. They actually saw the traumatic event as being one of the more powerful growth-inducing events in their life. And Feeney and Collins did a study of a variety of different couples who had gone through a serious stress, such as losing a child, or experiencing a financial upset in their life, or losing a parent, different significant stressors. And what they found is that the couples that approached it from the perspective of the inevitability of stress, the reality that this had happened in their life and that they needed to move through it, but needed to move through it together, reported a significant strengthening of their bond and an increase in their comfort in their own social abilities, social relationship, and also a greater connection to their broader social network. And so what they found was that rather than causing a person to kind of curl up in a ball and avoid life, people who approach this with a positive mindset actually led to a great deal of increase in satisfaction in their relationships. So what they conclude in all these different studies is that facing stress and adversity increases resilience, increases the ability to deal effectively with future challenges in your life. And so taking this research, we then move into what are some of the main pieces that we as adults can embrace in our life, and then can hopefully model for our children so that it begins to give them a different perspective in terms of the impact of stress on their life. And so the first piece that I wanted to touch on is what I've already spoken about at various different points, is what is called the stress mindset. And the stress mindset is something that has been explored for the last 15, 20 years, but went through a research study about a year and a half ago coming out of the pandemic, where they studied a very large group of college students. And what they found was that when you measure people in the general population, that what we naturally fall into, just like whether we're measuring intelligence, just like whether we're measuring our ability to solve different problems, when we're looking at different aptitudes, the same thing is true with the stress mindset, that it falls according to a very predictable continuum, a very predictable curve in terms of how people look at stress in their life. And there's a relatively large group in the center of the curve that looks at stress as being something unpleasant, unfortunate, that they don't really like, but it is part of our life and you got to deal with it. And sometimes you get thrown off your game with it and sometimes you do well with it. But that on the left side of the continuum are people who look at stress as being debilitating, or stress as being something that was sort of negatively thrown into a person's life, and see it as more of a negative event and something that is unfortunate and something that you get stuck in. And then on the other end of the continuum, stress is enhancing. So you've got this small group of people in kind of the right side of the curve that see stress as being a really positive thing, something to court in your life, something enhancing. You've got most of us that clump in the middle of stress is, but I don't like it, but kind of vacillate back and forth with how I deal with it. And then these group of people on the left end of the curve that see it as debilitating. And that the people who see it as harmful or debilitating, they have a much higher incidence of emotional disturbance, a much higher level of depression, a much higher level of anxiety, a much higher level of avoidance, a much higher level of procrastination. Whereas people who see it as being actually helpful or something to be courted have very low rates of emotional instability, emotional disorders, anxiety disorders, depression disorders. Same thing on this threat and challenge curve. People who see stress as a threat in their life, as opposed to a challenge to be faced and to be able to be overcome, tend to have a much higher incidence of social and emotional disorders. People who see it, embrace it as an opportunity for growth, tend to have much greater outcomes. And people who are able to turn stress into excitement, those weird people who actually say, I love stress and I want to jump right into the deep end with it, and I actually find it to be exciting, they tend to find themselves in situations that they're able to face greater levels of stress and are able to come through this in an effective fashion. And so the basic outcome of the research is that the first thing that we need to do as adults in our life is to really have a little bit of time to sit with, where do I sit on that stress mindset continuum? And is there a way I can nudge myself more towards the middle or the upper end of the continuum to be able to see stress in a helpful way, see it as a challenge, see it as something that could be exciting and an opportunity for growth, and embrace the idea that adversity exists in our life and it actually makes you stronger. So it's what in the psychology world we call cognitive restructuring. It's about taking something that we very often might embrace in a negative way or might create a lot of negative self-talk, and can we take that self-talk and move it more into a helpful place. The second part of the research focuses on what's called that stress response cycle, and the need to make sure that when you have stress in your life, you are allowing your body to go through the entire cycle to get to the place of de-stressing, recognizing that the stress hormones are going to be in your body, but needing to do specific self-care things in a very intentional and very strategic and very structured way so that you go through the entire stress response cycle and get to the other end of it so that your body discharges the stress. And so some of the different things that the research is showing very clearly is first part of dealing with the stress response cycle is just acknowledging that there are bumps in the road, acknowledging that stress exists, acknowledging the things that are upsetting you. Second piece, put on your own oxygen mask before you reach over and try to take care of other people. If you're one of those caretaker types and you're constantly taking care of your children, your spouse, your coworkers, that's a beautiful trait to have, but you're going to get to a point where your cup is empty and you're not able to take care of yourself. And so it's critical that periodically you put yourself first and you put on your own oxygen mask before you're constantly doing for other people. Third piece, focusing on what you are able to control rather than focusing on all the uncontrollables in our environment. We've just come through one of the more stressful periods of time in, I think, probably most of our lives with the pandemic. We're, obviously still at a place where there's the little rumblings in the background of the COVID response and what that's done to all of our levels of mental health and things like that. And within that period of time in the pandemic, the thing that ended up happening to most of us was this constant feeling of being out of control. Every time you turned on the news, every time you looked at a newspaper, every time you talked to somebody in your life, it was the idea of not being in control. This crazy virus out there. We didn't know where it was going to be, where it was going to turn up, when it was going to take you out of work, when it was going to keep you from being able to go on a vacation, when it was going to keep you from doing any of the things that we need to do as human beings. We lived in this constant sense of we were out of control. The people who weathered that period most effectively were the folks that were able to zero in on what can I control in my day-to-day? What can I do to stay present in my day-to-day and not focus on what's going to happen 6 months from now, what happened in the past, but staying present, focusing on what you can control. That's what the human brain craves, is this feeling of being in control and feeling that the things that are outside of your control, let them be outside of your control. Don't try to control things that you can't. Try to come back into your present. What do I need to do today to get through today? Building in time daily in your life to relax, taking some time for yourself. Obviously, sleep, exercise, diet. We're going to talk about sleep a little bit more in a moment. Picking your turn-off time for your cellular devices, for disengaging with other people, really intentionally taking time away from things that continue to put you back into this mode of feeling like you're out of control. I know for myself, my biggest downside is my inability to not keep checking my email and keep checking my text. And I find myself at times getting into bed and turning on my iPad to sit and read something nice, and a little message comes up. And those nights that I can avoid that and really say, I am not checking into anything. This is my me time, and really can practice that self-control. I end up having a much better night of sleep. And those nights that I don't do that, it tends to keep playing through my brain. And so really picking your turn-off time, being very intentional about that, taking time for yourself, making sure you're building in time to socialize, turning to other people for help when you need it, and then modeling that for your kids, modeling self-care. So these are what the research is showing as being some of the critical daily practices that you need to go through to make sure that you're allowing the stress response cycle to properly work its way through in your system. And what is being shown over and over in terms of the parenting literature is that if you are telling your kids to take care of themselves and telling your kids to focus on the present and don't worry so much about the test that you've got next week, you'll get there, you'll be able to find the time to study for it. And if you're not building in time for your kids to have downtime and stuff like that, or actually if you're saying all that, but you're not doing it yourself, your kids are only going to listen to what they see you doing. And so it's critical that you practice these things, model these things, and your kids are going to notice what you're doing much more than what you might be saying. Okay, kids don't really pay attention to what you say, I hate to tell you, but what they do notice is what you are modeling yourself. Okay, any questions so far there? And so in terms of some of the different daily habits of helping your kids go through the stress response cycle, these are just some of the little things that we do on a day-to-day basis, or that we should be doing on a day-to-day basis ourselves, and also should be trying to help our kids move towards all these different creative ways of working through some of the things you might be feeling. A little physical contact, having enough sleep, connecting with your peers, being in nature, laughter, some of these different pieces. All of these are the great ways for helping your kids be able to deal with things. And so this PowerPoint is going to get sent out to everybody who's on this call, anybody who registered for this, you'll get this sent out to you. I would make a copy of this slide and put it on your refrigerator, put it up in your kid's room. These are the types of things that we want to keep making sure our kids are doing, and use the terminology of saying, you got to work your way through the stress response cycle. You got to make sure you're going through the whole cycle. And that is recognizing that you're stressed, and that's cool and it's helpful. It's going to help you deal with challenges. And you need to make sure during each day you're building in some of these things so that you recover from stress. So the next 5 slides are going to go through what the research says are the 5 most important qualities of dealing with stress in a proactive, positive way. So we've touched on a lot of different pieces, but these next 5 slides are what the research is saying are the most important components. So if you've listened to nothing else that I've had to say, this is the point to pay attention to it. So these are the 5 big takeaways. The importance of staying present. Some of these I've already mentioned, so it's repeating some things, but staying present and acknowledging that I am stressed, and that's okay. There's this term in psychology called radical acceptance. If you've done any research in what's called dialectic behavior therapy, DBT, one of the things that you'll read about is this term radical acceptance, which is basically, in a nutshell, it's much more complicated than this, but in a nutshell, all it is accepting that there's a lot of crap in life. There's a lot of stuff that really is awful, and just being able to accept it and sit in it and sit in the discomfort, learn to tolerate discomfort, realize that discomfort goes through a cycle just like anything else, feels horrible, feels unbearable, and now it starts to feel bearable again. And that radical acceptance of these horrible events, but being able to sit in them and allow it to run through its cycle. Staying present by focusing on what you can control. So this guy, Dr. Medeiros, he did research on how just doing little projects that have a beginning, a middle, and an ending, things like as simple as doing the laundry. You put it in the washing machine, you turn it on, you put it in the dryer, you fold it, it's done. These little projects basically are ways that your brain recognizes that you are in control and you can approach different challenges and work your way through them. And literally putting in little projects in your day, creating a little to-do list that you can check things off, making peace with the fact that there are certain things you're not going to be able to accomplish, and then staying present, just sitting in the present, feeling what you're feeling in the moment. All of these pieces that go into that component of staying present, the research shows over and over again, that is point number 1 for being able to work through the stress response cycle. These are a few different mindfulness apps, Headspace, Stop, Breathe, and Think, Smiling Mind. This will also be in the resource page that we'll get to in a few moments. but just some different things to put on your radar, things that you can download, have some great ways of doing some mindfulness exercises that are just good ways of helping your body stay in that eustress mode. The second most important thing in terms of their stress response cycle is the importance of sleep. Research showing that lack of good sleep impairs attention, working memory, mood regulation, executive functions. There's this really cool research that showed with a group of middle school students, they did research on these students on nights that they got good nights of sleep, nights that they did not get good nights of sleep, giving them different aptitude tests. And what they found is that after poor sleep, their aptitude for different skills dropped a full year to 18 months. So you can, if you think about the idea of kids who are having chronic difficulties in sleeping and not being able to get into that REM sleep and non-REM sleep and have their brain go through the different cycle to allow them to really de-stress their body. And then we send them off to school, and then their teachers are saying that they're inattentive and they're not able to complete things and all that. And then you bring them to a psychologist like me who's doing testing, and the psychologist isn't asking about what's happening with the child's sleep, and then the kid gets diagnosed with ADHD or some other diagnosis. A lot of times, what we're finding is when we really dig into just what's happening on a day-to-day basis, and is the child getting proper sleep? Are they turning off their screens at a certain time? Are they not having food right up until bedtime? Are they relaxing for that last hour before sleep? Are they only using their bed for sleep rather than for doing their homework or connecting with their friends? Are they keeping their room cool and dark? If they're not doing these different sleep hygiene pieces, going for a really high-priced psychoeducational evaluation until you got your child onto a proper sleep habit, you're probably not getting the best estimate of what your child's capable of, because lack of sleep over a period of time can mimic all of the symptoms of an attention disorder, all of the symptoms of an executive functions disorder. And so it's critical that we make sure that our kids on average are getting a proper sleep cycle. And it's critical that you yourself are getting into that good sleep cycle, or else your own ability to tolerate your children's ups and downs and stressors and things like that are going to be much less as well. So point number 2 in the stress response cycle is the importance of sleep. Any questions there? The next thing is the importance of play. I'm seeing a chat come up there. So the importance of play, the third most important facet that so many of us have lost touch with. Brene Brown, one of my favorite social scientists. If you don't know Brene Brown, put her on your list of people to read or people to listen to her podcast. But she came up, or she used this term, play is time spent without purpose. And I started to think in my own life what my day-to-day playtime was, and realized that I am at the most critical, probably play deficit of any point in my life. Pretty much every moment of my waking life is spent with some purposeful activity rather than just time that my brain is zoned out and I'm doing nothing. And so one of the things by preparing for this presentation that I've made the commitment to myself on is to build into my life time spent without purpose, just time that is open-ended time, maybe just going out for a walk, maybe just sitting on the back deck looking out at a tree, maybe just having time that I am not accomplishing anything. And if we think about our kids, so often we feel like we're being great parents when we give our kids all of the different opportunities in life, the opportunity to participate in 20 different activities and the opportunity to have structured play dates and all these different pieces. And all of these are great different activities. But if we don't give our kids time without purpose, we're not giving them the opportunity to de-stress. We're not giving them the time to really build their own creative energy. And what we need to do as parents and as adults in kids' lives is to create a playlist for your family of time to just play a game, time to run around the backyard, time to build something that doesn't have some ultimate function in mind, just existing and using time in a way that just allows it to pass. And this guy, Dr. Stuart Brown, who's the director of the National Institute for Play, I didn't even know there was a National Institute for Play, but turns out there is. I think I'd like to get a job there. He said that the opposite of play is not work. The opposite of play is depression. And when I stop to think about that, it really is true that when you really start to take all of the fun and spontaneity out of your life, it starts to create this petri dish to sink into sadness and depression. And so critical to build in time for play in your child's life. Next thing, the importance of laughter. Laughter is the best medicine. We've all heard that proverb, but what we might not realize is the medical benefits of laughter. They've done a lot of research of people who actually intentionally put into their day time to laugh. And they actually did a study of this, of people who added more laughter time into their day, that it actually showed a measurable boost in their immune system. They showed that it brought their blood pressure down for 45 minutes. It triggers the release of endorphins. It protects your heart. There are these medical benefits of laughter. It burns calories. So those of you who can't get to the gym, just have a good belly laugh and you'll start burning calories. And it also reduces the impact of the negative emotions. It balances out the negative emotions. So the fourth component to the stress response cycle is the importance of laughter on a day-to-day basis, making sure that you build this in, have times to come up with what was the funniest thing that happened to you today. Sit down and watch some silly rom-com or something that is just totally mindless. Read something that's mindless. Look at little videos that are fun and joking and stuff like that. And laughing together strengthens relationships. So doing it with your kids, doing it with your spouse, doing it with your friends, it can strengthen the relationships. And the final component to the stress response cycle is practicing gratitude and self-compassion on a day-to-day basis. Really stopping and intentionally noticing the things in your life that are good things, the things that you've received that are gifts from other people, gifts from the universe, whatever ideology you want to put it into, but noticing the things in your life that you're grateful for. Acknowledging the role that other people play in providing goodness in your life, and being compassionate to yourself. Rather than beating yourself up that you didn't get to the gym for an hour, stopping and being compassionate and saying, I had all these other things I did take care of, and I took time to really spend a few minutes with my child to make my child laugh, and notice the things that you're doing on a positive way, and being compassionate to yourself for the fact that we never are going to be able to achieve all the goals we set for ourselves. That's okay. Practicing compassion and gratitude are components that help the stress response cycle go through its total loop. And there are medical benefits to this as well. It strengthens your immune system, improves your sleep patterns, reduces feelings of loneliness. Things that you can do is create a gratitude journal. Stop and focus on the senses and some of the ways that your senses are being fed from your environment. Having little visual reminders of things to be grateful for. Just meditating on a couple of things that you're grateful for. That's the fifth component to completing the stress response cycle. Some resources. I mentioned the book by Kelly McGonigal, The Upside of Stress. I mentioned Brene Brown, Rising Strong is a great book. Kenneth Ginsburg, Building Resilience, The Psychology of Gratitude, Everyday Mindfulness. Each one of these is a fantastic book. There are probably 1,000 others, but these are just some excellent ones that really emphasize the idea that stress exists. Deal with it. Get ready for it. It's going to be there for you. And if you approach it in that sort of an open way and embrace it and bring it into your life, have moments where you do mindfulness exercises. Each one of these is a great app that you can download. These are some great podcasts and blogs that are really have some fun stuff to them. recognize it's going to be there. It's your opportunity for growth. It's inevitable. It's not a bad thing. It builds resilience. I love this. I mean, you can tell sort of when I was listening to music most, but Alanis Morissette, Jagged Little Pill, great album. If you don't know it, I don't know where you existed over the last 50 years, but anyway, go listen to Alanis Morissette. But the song You Learn is basically embracing all this. You live, you learn, you face all these horrible things. Sit and listen to that song and just spend a little bit of time and just sit with it. And it has a pretty good message to it. Stay in the present, focus on what you can control, practice gratitude, self-care, self-compassion are the keys. So that basically wraps all of that up. Does anybody have any questions? So one of the things in the chat is, will the resources be sent out? Yes, this whole PowerPoint will be sent out, as well as a video recording of it. So everybody will get that. So you'll have that as well as the other different slides in there.
I have a question, Chris.
Yep.
Great presentation, by the way. Thank you. You talked about kids and sleep, and we all know that the humans in our life who need the most sleep are the ones getting the least of it. That's our teenagers. What do you or people on this call feel is an effective strategy for kind of helping teens who may even intellectually understand that, but they just cannot resist staying up, and burning the candle at both ends?
Yeah, it's a great question, Dave. The first thing that I say to parents when they're struggling with the idea of they can't get their kids to just turn off their devices, they've got to check their TikTok once more, Instagram or whatever, and all these different distractors that we have built into our life, is I really ask the parents to very honestly reflect on what are they doing themselves. And so it goes back to that modeling piece. And more often than not, we're screaming at our kids to do this, but we're not doing it ourselves. We're sitting there at the dinner table, checking our texts, and we're, checking things right up to bedtime and have the TV on and all that sort of stuff. So first, I say, before you expect your kids to do this, make sure you're doing it yourself. Second thing I do is I say, look, you're not going to be able to control this totally, but I do find that if you sit down with your teens, with your kids in general, but certainly with your teens, and you say, look, I wasn't born yesterday. I haven't lived under a rock for the last 50 years. I was a teenager as well. I was a young adult as well. I know the incredible drive to, you want to stay connected, or you have to get all this stuff done. I totally get it. Let's just sit here, and can we spend 15 minutes, and can we just each throw out there, just to have a little bit of a brainstorming sessions of what can we do to maybe make one small little change that we can each kind of take the initiative to say, we're going to try this over the next couple of days to see if this has any positive impact. I find that just having an honest discussion about how hard this is, an honest discussion of what can we do as a family, not what can you do as my 16-year-old, but what can we do as a family to just begin nudging it in direction. Don't go from the idea of like, stop staying up till 1 a.m. and now you've got to go to bed at 9 o'clock. What can we do to move it from 1 o'clock to 12:30, 1 o'clock to 12 o'clock? Take small little bite-sized pieces. And what can we all do as a family to be able to move it in that direction? And I would also probably share just some of the research that you came across of like how there is proven data to show that you're basically taking your brain and rolling it back by a year and a half. And so, you may think that you're getting something out of studying that extra half hour, but you're not. You're really not getting much out of it at all. I find sometimes just those honest discussions, the reality of this is not easy. It's not something that any of us do naturally. What little steps can we take sometimes starts moving the bar a little bit.
Thanks, Chris.
Other questions?
Hi, Chris.
Hello.
I was asking whether an hour to relax is the same is sort of, you want an hour not on your screen. Could you just say a little bit more about, like, I think you said it's good to have an hour to relax into bed, and I just didn't know what that meant exactly.
Yeah, so what that means is that hour up to bedtime, what the research is showing is that you really do want to disconnect from any devices as much as possible. That there's, obviously all the research on the specific light waves that are in some of these things, but also there's the huge research in terms of, that most of the different sites that we tend to go on, whether it's a YouTube channel or whether it's TikTok or whether it's checking your email or whatever, these sites are created by brilliant minds that are, playing to an algorithm of wanting to keep you connected. And so whether you know it or not, your brain is being tapped into to keep it stimulated, to keep it engaged. And so what I really recommend for parents as well as for kids is that you have an hour leading up to bedtime that is just disengaging from any electronic device. It can be reading, it can be listening to music, it can be playing a game with family, it can be just lying there and doing nothing and staring up at the ceiling, just really disconnecting as much as possible from that hour as you possibly can.
Got it. Thanks.
And I keep telling your daughter, Judy, that she's got to start going to bed early. Does she tell you that I say that to her every night? So,
Yeah. Yes. I'm
Judy is
thinking about her.
Judy is my sister-in-law, and I get to speak to her daughter practically every night. So
Yes. This is great, Chris. Thank you.
any other questions before we sign off? I see something in the chat here. Would I say that TV is in the same category? I would put TV in the same category, but a little bit lower in the category, meaning that TV is a little bit more of a passive stimulus as opposed to an active stimulus in the brain. So a lot of the different apps and things that we tap into have algorithms that keep your brain actively engaged as opposed to television that's a little bit more of a passive event. So I put it a little bit lower on the continuum of things that you want to totally disengage in. But if possible, I would still even kind of cut off the TV a little bit before you're trying to zone out as well. And the question of, may I share this presentation with my teenage daughter? I would love everybody on this to share this with your kids, definitely with your friends, your spouses, all that sort of stuff. Absolutely, feel free to do so. So it's 11 o'clock. I'm going to sign off, but if anybody needs to reach me, if you have any further questions, you can always reach out to Sasco River. Going on to our website is sascoriver.com. You can always get an email to me by it's hello@sascoriver.com. That comes to me as well as one of my staff members. So feel free to reach out if you've got any questions. Okay. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll talk soon.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Chris.
Great.
Bye.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thanks.